I went out into the community the following day to be with the community in its upsetness. And on the streets outside of the Cato home were about 100, 150 police officers lined up in riot gear. At some point, I realized that the young black men, teenagers, were picking up rocks and stones and bottles and lining up preparing to rush the police. I called Dr. Newman, sharing with him my concern about what the kids were about to do. He suggested that I go out and speak to some of the women on the streets and ask them to join me in intervening on this situation. I did, and people said to me, Dr. Fulani, I respect you, but I'm not about to get in the midst of that battle. I then, at some point, with the two people who were there as my security, went into the streets and for 4 hours, using some combination of mother wit and cursing and yelling, got the kids to back down. And one of the things that stayed with me was that in response to my saying to the kids that they were going to get slaughtered, they kept shouting at me that they had nothing to live for. Their responses broke my heart, and when they finally dispersed, I vowed to myself that I would continue to strengthen my work with them at the All-Stars. It also turned out that many of the officers, some who had been promoted to higher office, were out on the streets that day. So when I began running the program, Operation Conversation Cops and Kids, they would come up to me and thank me for preventing what would have been a street riot and applauded the work that I was doing with the cops and kids.
Dr. Fulani, welcome.
Hi, it's so great to be here again with you.
It's great to have you. So, performance, what does that have to do with justice?
Well, I mean, basically, even though we don't think about it in this way, people, all kinds of people, we perform our lives. We learn how to approach things, we have various responses, and it's not as if they're innate. And so at the All-Stars Project, which I helped to co-found 30 some odd years ago, we understand that performance allows for human beings to do things that they normally don't know how to do, to take risks, to basically step outside of whatever their personality is, or what they think their personality is, and do all kinds of creative things in the world. And it's how babies develop. It's not like babies have all of these thoughts about, I'm going to walk, I'm going to crawl, I'm going to play with my toys. They do new things, and in the process of doing that, they grow and expand.
So you have kids coming together with cops, basically, and they're playing their roles, real life roles in a way. How does that actually work?
Basically, I create an opportunity at some point early in the process of doing these workshops where the young people and the police officers do skits together. Curtain up.
Kids, what kind of pets do you want?
I want a tiger.
Tiger, I don't know about
A tiger. This is a small. It's
A
one
white one too.
one bathroom, one kitchen. I don't think we have the
Who's
space
cleaning
for
up
a
the
Tiger
tiger.
can sleep in your bedroom.
I have a big backyard.
Could escape, I don't know.
Yeah.
Alligator. I want an alligator.
Alligator could. We have a big pool back there, so we could just
I
throw
think
it
we're
in
gonna
there.
need a moat. As I said, the rent's already too high. One
Alligator's cool
bathroom,
too.
Is no one concerned about injuries from wild animals? No?
Our family lives on the edge, so we're
one. Yeah. Alligator, tiger.
White one.
Oh, okay.
Tony the tiger. That's that's pretty cool.
I'm
I
not a
like
fan.
it. Let's do it.
I'm not a fan of Frosted Flakes. What do you want?
How about a dog?
They have this ridiculous and absurd conversation and they perform together. And in the process, one of the things that it does is it humanizes one to the other, because the young people don't think that cops have a sense of humor. They have all these ideas about who they are and what they can do. And so when they see the police officers sort of falling over themselves in laughter and literally being silly, they sort of love it. And we do that before we do the conversation part of the workshop, because it creates an environment where people are able to hear each other and also to think new thoughts and ask creative questions.
And what is it they hear,
Well,
do you think?
in the course of the conversation, two of the questions that make a really big difference is, first of all, I ask the kids to say, what's the worst thing that's ever happened to them in their lives?
The worst thing that's ever happened to me, I'd have to say watching my grandfather get pulled out of the car and arrested for no reason. He came home and there was no reason. It was just, he fit the description.
I want you to repeat the story that you just shared with us. And officer, I want you to empathize with what you just said.
My father passed away when I was 6 years old of a heroin overdose. I found out the day my mom found him. I was at a friend's house and I was staying over, and she just told me, Dad passed away.
I'm sorry to hear that. I know you're going through high school. I lost one of my best friends for heroin overdose as well. It was probably one of the saddest days of my life. I'm sorry.
Shake hands.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our kids live in poor communities. They live in poverty, and every 5 minutes something goes wrong. So the kids talk about the deaths of people that are close to them. They talk about the incarceration of their fathers, sometimes their mothers. They talk about not having food and a variety of other kinds of things that even
Can the
though
cops relate to that?
well, yes. I mean, first of all, I think that some of the cops have come out of poverty and at least working class homes. But I think they don't necessarily think about that when they're patrolling the communities, even the cops who have grown up in the poor communities. So it actually penetrates. The kids have like unbelievable stories. And then the cops, on the other hand, when I ask them what's the hardest thing about being a cop, they talk about not being home with their families. They talk about being criticized by their families because they've become cops. They miss holidays. And because kids are kids, I think one of the things that really impacts them is when a cop says, I haven't been home for Christmas in 9 years. So then that creates,
It's interesting.
yeah, it creates the possibility to go new places and have new
But
conversations.
this is in a protected environment, a theater setting. How does it translate when they get back out into the streets?
Well, it's actually, a lot of it happens at the PAL Center, or it happens at my center on 42nd Street, or it happens in a school. It happens in the communities for the most part. And it's not so far from reality. I mean, when the cops walk in, the kids have, they have their response to that, and the cops have their response to the kids.
Because they're in uniform, right? The cops
Yes,
come in
and
uniform.
they're armed, they're cops.
They
And
come with guns as well.
Yes, they come as cops. And I have them sit in a circle, cop, kid, so they can't really avoid each other. The kids are sitting next to them. And I think it's an experience that, I know it is, that neither of them has ever really had before, and conversations that they've never had before. And the reports that I get from both the young people and the police officers is that when they're back out on the streets, they take some of what they've learned and done in the workshop with them. So, for
Do
example,
they see the same officers, or would they see the same officer on the street when they go home, and
Sometimes.
then change their attitude towards them?
sometimes, yes, because the officers come from a nearby precinct.
So what happens when they see each other out on the streets?
I think they've learned that they can do a different kind of performance. I think it also impacts upon the familiarity of one to the other, because it's a very intimate setting. It's a kind of setting that they've never been in. And I get reports from the kids and the cops of how they've done something different together, and even with strangers. I mean, one of the things that police officers oftentimes complain about is that when they're in the communities and a parent and their kid walks by and they say hello, nobody ever says hello back. So then they stop saying hello.
And now, does it change? Does it actually
Well, what
change in the streets?
changes is that they don't take it so personally, and I told them to keep saying hello, and at some point people will say hello. But if you get, an attitude because people won't speak to you, then that has an impact on whether or not they will ever speak to you. And also, that's not the biggest thing that's going on.
There's so much baggage right now in the relationship between cops and the community that I mean, we just have to look at the headlines to understand what's been happening around the country. Hard to imagine that just getting them together and learning how to say hello to each other is enough to overcome this baggage, which some people actually would argue goes back centuries.
Well, as an African American, I surely wouldn't argue against that. But I think the thing that the workshop helps the cops and kids look at is that what really is a problem in poor communities of color, and probably also in white poor communities, but we don't hear that much about this there, is poverty. A lot of what police officers are assigned to do is to navigate all the many things in our communities that don't go well. The school system is dysfunctional. I work with kids who take Regents exams in chemistry and they've never seen a science book. There's a listing of the 100 worst high schools in the city. The schools don't work. And that's not a cop problem, that's a political problem, that's a politician's problem, that's an educator's problem. And unless we do something about that, that's a big deal.
And it's a larger problem, really, than when we think about justice. We think about criminal justice, cops and kids in the street, officer-involved shootings. But you're already talking about a much larger concept of what justice is.
Absolutely, and it shapes the overall environment in huge ways. I have kids who come to my workshops, various places, to the All-Stars, and say to me, Dr. Fulani, I didn't eat for the last few days because we only had enough food for my little sister and I wanted her to eat. So that's it's extremely upsetting. And also if you're walking around and you're not eating, that has an impact. A lot of the kids don't even know what they're angry about. I work with kids who've been in gangs, who walk out on the streets and they are so pissed off, but they don't even know what it is. And what it really comes down to is, in my opinion, an abandonment of poor people in this country. And then we send the police officers in to manage all of that. And you need a social worker and jobs in order to manage all of that.
Some cops would argue the same, in fact. Do you think we can ever get past this? Are you optimistic that we can get to the next stage where people can actually understand some of the roots of these justice issues?
Well, yes, and some of it has to do, I think, with engaging the political establishment, and they're functioning more as leaders in our community and working with the community in better ways. I think it's a political issue.
And you've been a politician yourself in your earlier days.
Well, I think of myself
Are
not
you
as
hopeful?
a politician, but as a leader. I'm
Or
a
political
political
involved
leader,
person.
I'm a psychologist, I'm many things, and I grew up poor. I watched, I had 12 nieces and nephews, 6 of them are dead. My father died, when I was 12 because an ambulance service refused to come into the poor black community to take him to the hospital. So I have experiences like many ordinary other black and Latino and poor white people in this country that really have a tremendous emotional impact. So in order for the street to change, I think the country has to go through a very critical and important change relative to how it relates to poor people overall and how it relates to the black community. We still have not been integrated into American society. That's a big, 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 big deal.
Dr. Fulani, thanks so much for joining us today.
You're deeply welcomed.
The conversation about what it means to educate for justice and to do justice is, of course, one that we all have a stake in and one that we all should have a meaningful say in. And so here we are. To state the obvious, saying that we are educating for justice does not make it so. It hardly seems like a controversial proposition to say that we ought to be checking in with our students and with each other regularly to find out whether and to what extent the students think and feel that our mission is truly being realized. This is an exercise in critical introspection, something that is vital for any individual or community to thrive, particularly if it is dedicated to no less a grand principle than justice. But it is about a lot more than that. It's about thinking and talking about how we failed and how we've succeeded in our mission so that we can do better. Of course, this work won't be done today or at any special event. If we are truly serious about justice and educating for justice, the work will never end. Seriously engaging with justice is a full-time job. Some of you may be wondering at this point, what does any of this have to do with policing? The Bridging the Divide initiative is, after all, primarily about policing. This is more or less one of the questions that I'll ask our panelists to address, and I'm eager to hear their thoughts about it. For now, I'll quickly recount how this panel came to be. Just about a year ago, when we first started meeting to discuss the shape that the Bridging the Divide initiative would take, I proposed that we begin a critical collective conversation about what it means to educate for justice when it comes to specifically educating future police officers, others who will, in one capacity or another, end up working in the criminal justice system, and all the rest of our students who, whether as lawyers, social service providers, or just as citizens, will play a role in defining what justice means as an ideal and as a practice in our society. Michelle and I and some of our students discussed this prospect and decided to move forward. It seemed to me then and now that a crucial aspect of the Bridging the Divide initiative would have to consist of a serious interrogation of where we're at as an institution, specifically with respect to the roles that the college has played or hasn't played in shaping how policing works in New York City and in other places around the country. And one very specific question I had was whether we're doing everything we can as an institution to ensure that we're graduating students who have some working conception of what justice is and a commitment to doing justice in whatever work they end up doing, especially if it's in policing or corrections. Without going into too many specifics, part of the backstory driving my concern was, of course, the horribly tragic and profoundly unjust killings of Eric Garner, Michael Brown, and, as we're all too painfully aware, the list goes on. And sadly, maddeningly, it's worth noting that since then, the list has continued to grow. Are we doing everything we possibly can as an institution to ensure that our students will go forth into the world with something like a critical understanding of and commitment to justice, as opposed to, say, simply being prepared to get a job in the justice system? And in particular, are we doing so with respect to students who go on to work in fields in which they will possess immense powers? In the case of the police, the power to take away liberty, and as we've seen, even life. I've come up with a series of questions that I plan to pose to the panelists, and I'll read them off in a minute, but I don't want to impose a structure in this conversation. I want everybody to speak to what matters most to them within the parameters of, pretty broad parameters of, what it means to educate for justice, why it's important, what justice means to each of the panelists who are sitting here, and so on and so forth. So the questions that I'm about to read off, think of them as kind of guideposts. What I'd like to accomplish as much as possible here is a genuine conversation, and genuine conversations work best when it's a back and forth. So that's pretty much what I have in mind. So again, these questions are just suggestive in nature. And let me just go ahead and throw the first one out so we can get going. And if it makes sense to raise the other questions in the context of the conversation that we're having, then I'll do so. If other questions make more sense, then I'll raise those. And of course, I don't need to be the only person who raises questions here, right? We can all do that in keeping with having a real conversation. Okay, so first question should be a pretty obvious one in the context of this discussion. What does justice mean to you? And of course, I'm addressing that to all the panelists here. Who wants to start?
You want to start? I guess I'll start. I guess to me, justice would be breaking through any sort of oppression that communities face on a daily basis, because there's so many things that communities go through on it that really aren't necessary, and these oppressions change the way that everyone views each other. And I think with justice, it kind of moves past that and lets us live in a better society, and I think that's what we have to move forward to.
So to me, justice means putting aside gender, socioeconomic background, as well as race under the law. I think that's a really important thing that definitely highlights to me when I talk about what justice means.
Well, I certainly have a few things that I could say about what justice means, but I feel
as one of the seniors here on the panel, along with Professor Rowan, that I would speak to my role as an educator in advancing justice. And what I've strived to do in all of the classes that I teach here, again, I'm an economist, and one might say, well, what does an economist have to teach about justice? Well, I try to make sure, and I think my students could attest to this, that when I'm teaching them, I always teach about what, first of all, the historical context within which there are disparities in the country. Why is it that we have a nation that is an outlier compared to the rest of the world regarding the rate at which we incarcerate people and the sheer number of people we have behind bars? I try to teach my students not only about who's dealing with poverty, but why. And so my job is to facilitate their understanding of what has preceded and what feeds into injustices, because they are currently citizens of the world, and they're going to go out and continue to be citizens of the world. So I feel that part of my job is not just to instruct them and provide them the basic tools within the economics discipline, but to go beyond that and to provide them with the understanding, the information, the history of disparities in this country that Dr. Fulani talked about that leads to things like black-on-black crime, things like police brutality, things like racism, discrimination, sexism, homophobia. And so from that angle, as an educator, I take that role and that responsibility in terms of teaching very seriously.
Well, when it comes to justice, I take a broader scope, and I think of righteousness. I think of the difference between right and wrong, and it's a very fine line, but that's what we look at. As fierce advocates for justice, we look at these principles and we try to find where we should stand. Of course, justice includes pursuit for truth, and that's something that really has to be held as a principle when we speak about justice. When we speak about justice, it involves clarity, it involves transparency, and it involves knowledge, knowing what has occurred in the past, as Professor Holder mentioned earlier, learning about that history. And we can see that in our history, it's a bit opaque and covered in just grime. And that's something that we need to be aware of if we want to pursue justice.
I would have to agree with all of the panelists. I think what I would add to the commentary is that I was wrestling with this question last night, and I think what's really, really important, approaching it from a more creative aspect, is that justice would be collaboration, not domination. And I'll be super honest, and I think a lot of people in the crowd would agree with me. When Americans, we don't know what justice is, honestly. Like, we can get, educations and, credentials, you can make an educated guess, you could do your best, try, effort. You get, effort can make up for a lot, but I don't know what justice is. I could imagine, I have an idea. I think, like he said, there's a fine line between right and wrong. I want to imagine it's that, but then you get, because of history, again, borrowing from Franklin and Professor Holder, it starts to get a little cloudy, where right and wrong doesn't just become right and wrong anymore. And it's like, the cliche term, the more you know, the less you realize you know. I'm continuously learning new stuff, and it becomes so much harder to understand. English is already a very confusing language as is. It's very new. So, and I only speak English, unfortunately. So, yeah, so it's just, I really don't, I don't have an answer for that, but I know it definitely incorporates collaboration and absence of domination.
So, at least a few of you have already spoken to this. The next question I was going to raise is, what does educating for justice mean to you? And to move the conversation forward, I guess what I'm asking about here is, where I'm trying to go with this is to move beyond the abstract to the concrete. That doesn't necessarily have to be in the classroom, but what is, in your mind, what is true education for justice? What does that look like? Seems to me that one way of thinking about this is by being creative, being imaginative, and thinking, what would educating for justice look like in a radically more just future?
Start there. Since we started,
No problem.
it's on to you guys.
I'm actually glad that I could start this one. Thank you. Honesty, and the truth is very ugly. Most, in my opinion, from what I've gathered, it's politically correct to say I want to hear the truth, but a lot of people don't want to hear the truth, especially in America. That's from my firsthand experience, and you have to be honest. And given, I just speak in terms of America because that's where we're at. It's ugly. America is ugly. Like, I actually wrote a blog post on, like, it's nothing, professional. It's just a place for me to vent. America is not beautiful. Like, we have a lot of liberties, we have a lot of privileges, and there's a lot of great things to point out. But I think that's the problem. And if you refer that back to justice, that's exactly how injustices happen. By, you want to look at the cup half full, not half empty. But you don't want to be delusional, and I think us as Americans, we're very delusional, especially in terms of like the tougher subjects, and that's for various reasons, because we all come from different walks of lives. But I think you have to start with the ugly. I'm not sure, but we haven't done it. Like, you talking in terms of being creative, imaginative. I don't believe in the system. It's failed me. It's failed everybody I know. Cliche, right? But I don't believe in the system. Everything I've seen, I don't agree with. It's very for me. It's very little to pull from the motto and the system that we've set up. Like, oh yes, we can keep this. Oh, we can keep that. Like, I don't see that, because I see the truth. I see a ugly reality every day. Even still, thank God I'm a lot more educated, so I can navigate through these obstacles a little better than my average peer. But I have friends that they probably won't be here by the summer. You know what I mean? That's just probably some of you in the crowd, and that goes to incarceration, death, just a number of things. So that may not be everybody's reality, but if I like to liken it to a chain, and I'll wrap it up on this. You're only as strong as your weakest link. So if we're, as Americans, we've been just praising our strongest links and forgetting our weakest links, there's no chain, there's no solidarity. So what you have is the exclusion of marginalized people and oppressed people. And the thing is, the system does a real good job of covering that up and whatnot, but then you'll have a Ferguson happen, you'll have a Sandra Bland happen, you'll have Trump happen. It's gonna pop up. You can't hide the truth will always come to the light. So I think just honesty. Like, I know it's like I went into a whole spiel, but you trace that back to honesty. That's the takeaway.
Well, when it comes to educating for justice, right, I want to bring it back to what Professor Rowan said earlier, is having this critical introspection where we dive in within ourselves and we look inside and we really know who we are. And that's something that in this institution and many others like it, that opportunity is not present. We tend to be very separated from what we're studying, and we don't see ourselves in those texts. We don't see ourselves in the oppression that's going on within what we're reading. So there has to be some kind of connection with what we're doing. So aside from that critical introspection and self-awareness, we need to be aligned with the truth. And that will happen in the same process when we really critically go within we start to align ourselves with the truth, and we start to see patterns in the external, patterns outside. You start to walk, when you take a class that really questions your values or makes you question your values, and you step outside, and then you start to see injustices everywhere. It just happens, and then you start to pinpoint where things could change everywhere, and that for me is educating for justice, and having that connection with the person that's educating you, with the person that's presenting you this knowledge, and we see day in and day out that barrier just keeps that gap just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Many of us can't say that we've had a conversation, a 5-minute, 10-minute conversation with a professor that's really insightful, because it's just the means aren't there. And educating for justice is providing that, bringing that to fruition. That relationship between the student and the teacher, and really going and knowing the self. That's what I have to say.
So, Mike, I think what I'd like to do is, as the other professor on the panel, I'm going to hold my comments until after all the students have spoken first, if that's okay with you. So I'm going to pass it to Yishay and then to Yulia, and then I'll add.
So I definitely agree that education for justice definitely requires honesty. And on top of that, I think it goes beyond teacher and professor-student relationship, and it goes with our peers as well. Especially being in the classroom, we actually sit by students who have had experience with law enforcement, whether it's negative or positive. And we learn through that, and I think that's very important, especially in John Jay. I'm not sure about other institution, but this is what I'm taking from being at John Jay, that I get a personal, more relationship with those who have, in fact, encountered law enforcement, rather than just reading it in the news or just hearing stories about it.
I just want to tie back to what was said over there about aligning with the truth, and I think that with educating for justice, it really takes a step into stepping out of your comfort zone and really understanding what is going on. And I think maybe just my experiences with professors have been lucky, but I've been able to have those conversations and really understand maybe my thinking and shape my own ideas to understand what is going on, why I shouldn't ignore the things that are happening in society today. So in terms of educating for justice, you mentioned the perfect world and how educating for justice would work in the perfect society. And I feel like in the perfect society, we wouldn't have to educate for justice for the same reasons we have to right now. So right now, with everything that's happening in society, with all the discrimination, with law enforcement and everything like that, that we have to educate for those reasons. But in a perfect society, we would have to educate to progress the justice that we would already have. So I think it does go past just a student-teacher, student-professor relationship. You have to have these conversations with the people around you. You have to educate each other and work towards justice.
And I would just add to what Yulia said, and Yishay said, and all the panelists have already said. And again, being one of the two seniors on the panel, and because there are so many students in the audience, I think it's important for me to talk about how I see educating for justice from my perspective as an educator. So Mike, if you wouldn't mind indulging me. So this is something I wrote as part of what might have been my formal presentation here, but it really speaks to the question that Mike just posed. So I'll just briefly read it. So my job, as I mentioned before, is to facilitate learning. And in all the courses that I teach, I make a central part of my teaching to expose and discuss issues of justice, unfairness, disparate treatment, and what can be done to address these things. For example, in my crime class and capitalism class, I help students understand what journalist Mike Taibbi calls the Great Divide, meaning how there appears to be two different approaches to justice for the rich and the poor. Witness the atrocities of stop and frisk in New York City versus the fact that no executive in any of the largest banking firms involved in the subprime mortgage crisis was ever indicted on a crime. In my political economy of racism class, I teach about the roots of racism in the US, the manifestations of it in the present day, and what could be done to combat it. My approach to quote unquote educating for justice is to first recognize that the students I'm teaching are and will be, as I mentioned before, citizens of this world. And so I must do my part. It is my responsibility as an educator to equip them with the knowledge and skills to contribute to a more just world where prosperity is shared more equitably, where violence has no place, and where peace needs to be the first goal of security. I recognize that many of my students will be going into law enforcement as police officers, as beat cops, as Dr. Falani mentioned, part of the military, maybe even the FBI. And I always say to them, remember what you learn in my class. Remember how I showed you very clearly how some of the communities you will be policing came to be poor, disenfranchised, and suspicious and scared of law enforcement. My mantra to my students who I know will be going into law enforcement is, remember what I tried to teach you, to show you about the world where discrimination still happens, where single mothers with children are among the poorest demographic in the US, where America became an outlier compared to the rest of the world regarding the degree to which it incarcerates its people, and who those people are that are getting locked up. Where did they come from? What did they do, and why? I know that's a bit of a long speech, but this is what I try to do with my students who I know will be going into law enforcement here at this college, as I try to do with all of my students.